Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into another fascinating deep dive with us.
Absolutely. Always excited to unpack these complex topics.
Okay, so today we're tackling race in America.
A topic that never seems to get old, unfortunately.
Right, and we're using Keith Boykin's book, New W, Why Does Everything Have to Be About Race, as our guide.
Which, by the way, the title alone sparks so much debate, it's incredible.
Seriously. It's like he knew exactly which buttons to push, and we've got a ton of your amazing contributions to weave in historical documents, legal stuff, even some pop culture takes. Should be interesting.
I'm really curious to see how those all connect.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so Boykin starts by taking on some really common arguments against talking about race. The kind of stuff that makes you wonder if you're living in an alternate reality.
Oh, absolutely. Like the I don't see color argument,
Yeah.
or the classic, why do we have to make everything about race?
Right. And he systematically dismantles them, which is so satisfying.
It's like he anticipates every eye roll and just perfectly explains why it's not that simple.
Exactly. One of the first things that really struck me was how he tackles this idea that electing Barack Obama somehow meant America had suddenly become post-racial.
Oh, yeah, like we had arrived.
Remember that, as if
Right.
his presidency was some grand finale to the struggle for equality.
Right. The ultimate proof that racism was over.
Case closed.
Except not really.
Not even a little bit.
And that's where this idea of a clean slate that Boykin talks about is so pervasive and so dangerous.
Because it allows people to just like wash their hands of the whole thing.
Exactly. Like, okay, we had a black president. What more do you want?
Right. But what Boykin does so effectively is bring us back down to earth, or rather back to the historical reality.
Which is often a lot less glamorous than we'd like to admit.
To put it mildly, he reminds us about the millions enslaved, the generations subjected to Jim Crow, the violence, the disenfranchisement, the outright terror that was used to maintain this racial hierarchy for centuries.
And how all of that, all of those injustices, created the very foundation of this country. We're not talking about ancient history here. This is the bedrock upon which America was built.
It's like saying one black president magically erases centuries of systemic oppression.
Yeah.
Which, when you say it out loud, sounds ridiculous.
Completely. It's like trying to mop up a flood with a teaspoon. You're not even scratching the surface of the problem.
And it makes you wonder, what would it even take to actually compensate for all of that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that Boykin doesn't shy away from.
Which is what makes his book so challenging. Because he's forcing us to confront the true scope of the problem.
And the inadequacy of our typical responses.
It's not about Obama as an individual. It's about the danger of thinking a single event, a single election, can somehow resolve centuries of deeply embedded inequality.
Right. It's a form of historical amnesia that's incredibly convenient, but ultimately incredibly harmful.
It's like saying, we checked that box, so let's move on. Which, now that you mention historical figures being used in this way, reminds me of how Boykin tackles the distortion of Dr. King's message.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Because everyone's heard the quote, right? Judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin.
It's like the go-to line for anyone who wants to shut down a conversation about race.
And it's often used so casually, completely removed from its original context.
Like it's become this bumper sticker slogan.
Exactly. But Boykin takes us back to that iconic I Have a Dream speech and highlights how people cling to this one line while ignoring the speech's larger call for systemic change.
Because Dr. King wasn't simply advocating for individual tolerance, right?
Right. He was talking about dismantling the entire system of racial hierarchy that permeated every aspect of American society. He called out racist politicians, police brutality, discriminatory housing policies. He was challenging the very structures of power.
He was a revolutionary, not just some, like, self-help guru advocating for better manners.
Exactly. He was demanding a complete overhaul of the system, which is probably why he was labeled a radical in his time.
And ultimately assassinated for it.
Which tells you just how threatening his vision was to those in power. And this discomfort with real systemic change is a recurring theme in Boykin's analysis.
Because it's a lot easier to talk about individual prejudice than it is to acknowledge the ways in which we all might be benefiting from a system that's rigged in our favor.
Exactly, and that's why he spends so much time dissecting the ways in which our historical narratives are often manipulated to protect the status quo.
So it's not just about misrepresenting individual figures like Obama or Dr. King. It's about using their legacies to silence any real conversation about systemic racism.
Exactly. And this manipulation extends to how political parties position themselves on race. This is where I think Boykin's examination of the Republican Party's historical shift is particularly insightful,
Right, because we constantly hear them touting themselves as the party of Lincoln.
always invoking that legacy. But what Boykin does so effectively is lay bare the stark contrast between that claim and their actual actions throughout history.
Right, because if you look at their record on issues like civil rights, voting rights, criminal justice reform, it doesn't exactly scream party of Lincoln, does it?
Not quite.
Wow.
And he doesn't let the Democratic Party off the hook either. He acknowledges their own complicated history, particularly when it comes to race relations in the Jim Crow South.
Right, because no political party has a perfect track record on this issue.
Definitely not. But what Boykin does so meticulously is document how the Republican Party, the party that fought to abolish slavery, underwent a significant transformation in its stance on race, particularly in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement.
And he doesn't just throw this out there as a theory, he provides concrete evidence. Like, he talks about the Southern strategy, which was his calculated political tactic.
It was a way to appeal to white voters, often by tapping into racial anxieties.
And to be clear, Boykin doesn't just throw this term around. He provides concrete examples. He actually quotes Lee Atwater, who was a prominent Republican strategist.
Yeah, he was like the mastermind behind some of these campaigns.
And Atwater basically admitted, and I'm paraphrasing here, that they moved away from using explicitly racist language to using more coded language, talking about states' rights and economic anxiety.
It was a way to appeal to the same voter base without being overtly racist.
Dog whistle politics at its finest.
Exactly. And it's a really disturbing historical evolution to trace because it shows how carefully crafted language can be used to mask deeper racial dynamics and how easily these historical narratives can be manipulated to serve political agendas.
Which is why I think this kind of deep dive is so important, because these arguments we hear all the time, they're not just abstract ideas floating around. They're rooted in very deliberate political strategies that have shaped the landscape of America. And you can't have a meaningful conversation about race in this country without understanding those power dynamics.
Absolutely. And that historical context is essential for understanding the arguments that Boykin tackles next, the ones centered around white victimhood and the denial of Black oppression.
Which is a whole other layer of complexity, right? Because it shifts the focus entirely, framing any discussion of racial inequality as an attack on white people.
Exactly. And that's where Boykin's meticulous research and his ability to connect those historical dots becomes even more critical. He meticulously unpacks these arguments, revealing the flawed logic and often unspoken assumptions that underpin them.
And it's that deep dive into historical context that I found so illuminating. It's like Boykin is saying, hold on, before we even get to these arguments about today, we need to unpack how we got here.
Absolutely. He connects these present-day arguments back to their historical roots, which often exposes the flawed logic at play. One of the most common ones, and you alluded to this earlier, is the "my ancestors were oppressed too" argument. It's this idea that because many European immigrants also faced hardships, the unique struggles of Black Americans should somehow be minimized or dismissed.
All right, like we're supposed to have this oppression Olympics and everyone gets a participation trophy.
Exactly. And Boykin doesn't shy away from acknowledging the very real hardships faced by various immigrant groups throughout American history. He talks about the discrimination, the poverty, the backbreaking labor. It was incredibly difficult. But as he points out, no other group was forcibly brought to this country in chains, stripped of their humanity, and then subjected to generations of deliberate, systematic oppression designed to maintain a racial hierarchy with them at the very bottom.
That's a really crucial distinction. It's not about saying one group's suffering is more valid than another's. It's about recognizing the unique and horrific legacy of chattel slavery and how it continues to shape the present.
Precisely. To say, my ancestors struggled too, as a way to shut down conversations about racial inequality, is to completely disregard the systems of power that were created to benefit one group at the expense of another. It's like saying, sure, the game was rigged, but my team lost too sometimes, so it's all fair now.
And that brings us to another layer of this historical amnesia. The refusal to acknowledge how that past continues to cast a long shadow on the present. I'm thinking about the wealth gap, the disparities in home ownership, the systemic disadvantages Black Americans face in education, healthcare, and employment. These didn't just magically appear.
They're the direct result of centuries of deliberate policy decisions designed to advantage white Americans. Boykin meticulously lays out the data, citing studies showing that the racial wealth gap in America is wider today than it was in the decades following the Civil War. Think about that for a moment. Generations have passed, and the economic consequences of slavery and Jim Crow are still acutely felt today.
It's like the game was rigged from the start, and even though some of the rules have changed, the players are still dealing with the consequences of that initial disadvantage. And it's not just about material disadvantages either.
You're absolutely right. Boykin talks about the psychological toll, the constant stress of living in a society where you are routinely seen as suspect, where you have to fight for even the presumption of innocence that others take for granted. That kind of lived experience takes a toll, and it's something that can't be measured in purely economic terms.
That really resonated with me. And it leads perfectly into another crucial point. Boykin makes the danger of the just comply narrative, particularly when it comes to police brutality. It's this idea that if black people would just do exactly as they're told by law enforcement, everything would be fine.
It's a seductive argument because on the surface, it seems to make sense. Who wouldn't want to avoid conflict, especially with figures of authority? But as Boykin meticulously unpacks, this narrative is rooted in a dangerous misunderstanding of both history and the present reality for Black Americans.
He talks about how this just comply idea is essentially a modern echo of what enslaved people were told for centuries.
Exactly, and he connects it back to the very origins of American policing slave patrols. These patrols were created specifically to enforce the subjugation of Black people, to maintain the racial hierarchy of the time. Compliance wasn't a guarantee of safety, it was a condition of survival within a system designed to dehumanize and control.
So when people say, well, if they had just complied with the police, they're completely ignoring the historical context that shaped those very interactions for generations.
Precisely. And what's even more disturbing is that this just comply narrative persists even in the face of overwhelming evidence that it's simply not true. Boykin sets countless examples of Black individuals who were killed by police even when they were unarmed, cooperating, or even calling for help.
These are the names we know, the cases that sparked outrage and protests.
And for every high-profile case, there are countless others that don't make the headlines. Boykin doesn't just list these tragedies, he humanizes them, reminding us that these are real people with families, with dreams, with lives cut tragically short.
It's a powerful reminder that this isn't just an abstract debate about statistics or policy. It's about real human lives at stake. And it makes the arguments that deny Black oppression all the more dangerous.
Absolutely. Because these arguments, often veiled in seemingly neutral language, serve to maintain the status quo, to silence dissent, and to ultimately preserve a system that continues to benefit some at the expense of others.
Which brings us to another silencing tactic. Boykin dissects the accusation of being unpatriotic, often leveled at Black Americans who speak out against injustice.
It's a powerful tool of control, because what could be more sacred in America than patriotism? Who are you to question the system, the flag, the very ideals of this nation? But as Boykin points out, this type of rhetoric reveals a very selective and ultimately dishonest interpretation of American history.
It's like they've conveniently forgotten that dissent is literally woven into the very fabric of American history.
Exactly. Boykin reminds us that the Founding Fathers themselves were rebels, revolutionaries who challenged the authority of the British Crown. They were willing to risk everything, their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor, to fight for the ideals of liberty and self-determination.
Yet, when Black Americans dare to raise their voices in protest, to demand that those very ideals be applied equally to them, they're often met with accusations of disloyalty, of hating America.
It's a blatant double standard, and Boykin exposes this hypocrisy masterfully, pointing out that many of those who criticize Black activism today revere figures like Thomas Jefferson, who literally advocated for revolution.
It's like they're saying, sure, revolution was great back then when it was white men fighting for their freedom, but now it's disruptive and inconvenient.
Exactly. And this selective memory, this rewriting of history to silence dissent, is a tactic as old as America itself.
Which leads us to a topic that often evokes strong reactions, a lot of discomfort: reparations.
It's a word that carries a lot of weight, a lot of historical baggage. And Boykin doesn't shy away from the complexity of this issue. He acknowledges that it's a challenging conversation, one that often evokes strong emotions on both sides. But he argues that it's a conversation we can no longer afford to avoid.
I remember when the topic of reparations first entered mainstream conversations, it felt like this radical, almost unthinkable concept.
It was often dismissed as unrealistic, unfair, even un-American. But Boykin challenges us to move beyond those knee-jerk reactions and engage with the issue in a more nuanced and historically informed way. He asks us to consider, what does it truly mean to repair the damage inflicted by centuries of systemic oppression?
And he provides some compelling historical context to support his argument.
He does. He points out that the government has in fact provided reparations in the past, though selectively. He cites the payments made to slave owners after the Civil War, not to the enslaved people themselves, but to those who had profited from their labor.
That's a jarring comparison, reparations for the enslavers but not the enslaved.
It highlights a disturbing pattern in American history, a willingness to acknowledge and address injustice only when it's politically expedient or when it benefits white Americans. He also brings up the example of reparations given to Japanese Americans who were unjustly interned during World War II.
Which is a more recent example, demonstrating that the concept of reparations isn't entirely foreign to American history.
Exactly. The government has shown a capacity for atonement, for acknowledging past wrongs and attempting to make amends. But when it comes to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, that same willingness seems to evaporate.
It's like there's a resistance to even acknowledging the conversation, let alone taking any concrete steps towards repair.
And that resistance, Boykin argues, speaks volumes. The immediate dismissal of reparations, the refusal to even engage in a good faith discussion about what it might look like, reveals a deeper unwillingness to fully grasp the depth of the harm caused and the ongoing legacy of those injustices.
It's almost like there's this fear that by even acknowledging the need for reparations, you'd be admitting guilt, right? Like accepting responsibility for something so deeply ingrained in the very fabric of this country.
It's a tough pill to swallow, for sure. And that fear, that avoidance, it's like a thread that runs through so many of these arguments Boykin unpacks, especially when it comes to the myths about Black inferiority.
These narratives that have been used to justify discrimination and inequality for, well, centuries.
It's the same old song and dance, just dressed up in slightly different clothes each time. The idea that Black people are inherently lazy, criminal, content to just sit around and collect handouts.
Incapable of governing themselves or contributing to society in meaningful ways.
All of those stereotypes, as pervasive as they are just flat out false. And thankfully, Boykin doesn't just call them out, he systematically dismantles them. He uses data, historical analysis, even personal anecdotes. It's really a multi-pronged approach.
And one of the most persistent myths he tackles is the one about welfare.
Oh, the infamous welfare queen.
Right. This image of, like, a Black woman living lavishly off government assistance while hardworking taxpayers foot the bill.
It's an image that's been used to justify so many harmful policies, and it's often repeated as fact.
But it is a myth.
Completely. Boykin actually cites studies that show the majority of welfare recipients are actually white.
Which makes sense, given that they make up the majority of the population.
Exactly. But facts often get drowned out by these powerful, emotionally charged narratives.
And Boykin does a great job of tracing this back to the deliberate racialization of welfare, particularly during the Reagan era.
Oh, absolutely. That's when that whole welfare queen image really took hold in the public imagination.
It's amazing how a single image, completely divorced from reality, can have such a lasting impact on public policy.
Propaganda is a powerful tool, and it often relies on exploiting our deepest fears and prejudices. Which brings us to another incredibly harmful narrative. Boykin tackles the myth of Black-on-Black crime.
This idea that Black communities are inherently more violent, more prone to criminality.
As if crime is somehow a uniquely Black problem.
Right. As if white people never commit crimes against other white people.
Exactly. And Boykin points out that statistically speaking, most crime is intraracial.
Meaning that people are more likely to be victims of crime committed by someone of their own race. It's not a Black thing or a white thing, it's a human thing.
Exactly. But this focus on Black-on-Black crime serves a very specific purpose. It allows people to sidestep the systemic issues that contribute to crime in all communities, regardless of race.
Things like poverty, lack of access to education and job opportunities, a criminal justice system that disproportionately targets Black and brown communities.
Right. It's about shifting blame away from the system and placing it squarely on the shoulders of Black people. It's a way to avoid having those uncomfortable conversations about how we might all be complicit in perpetuating these cycles of inequality.
And speaking of uncomfortable conversations, we can't forget about the myth of the broken Black family.
Oh, yes. The all too familiar narrative that places the blame for so many social ills on the absence of fathers in Black homes.
As if family structure is the sole determinant of a child's outcome.
Right, and as if other communities don't face their own unique family challenges.
Boykin does a really great job of unpacking this, of providing that historical context that's often missing from these conversations.
He reminds us that the very notion of the traditional nuclear family with 2 parents and 2.5 kids is a relatively recent construct in American history.
And for Black families, that construct was often brutally denied.
Absolutely. Starting with slavery, where families were routinely torn apart, and continuing through the Jim Crow era, where Black men were often unjustly imprisoned or forced into labor arrangements that kept them physically separated from their loved ones. You can't talk about Black family structures today without acknowledging that legacy of violence and disruption.
And to blame Black families for the consequences of that legacy is not only insensitive, but also incredibly dishonest. It's like blaming the victims for the very systems that were designed to break them.
It's a classic case of blaming the victim. And this pattern repeats itself in so many ways, especially in Boykin's analysis of Black leadership and so-called failing Black cities.
This is where I think his understanding of how power operates in America is so crucial.
It's not just about individual prejudice, it's about systems. And those systems were designed to benefit some groups at the expense of others.
And they're really good at self-preservation.
Oh, absolutely. He argues that even in cities where you have Black mayors, Black city council members, they're often operating within a system that's rigged against them from the start.
They're set up to fail, and then blamed for not succeeding within a game that was never designed for them to win.
It's a vicious cycle, and it speaks to the limitations of representation without a fundamental shift in power. Which, to bring this full circle, brings us to what I found to be one of the most insightful parts of Boykin's book, his analysis of how racism itself has been rebranded for a modern audience.
It's like racism has gone undercover, right? It's learned how to adapt, how to disguise itself in more subtle and insidious ways.
Exactly, and that makes it so much harder to call out because it's not as overt, it's not as in your face as it used to be. We're not talking about burning crosses or using racial slurs here.
It's a more coded language, a dog whistle racism, that allows people to uphold these systems of inequality without ever having to explicitly acknowledge what they're doing.
Precisely. Boykin talks about how these seemingly harmless phrases we hear all the time, playing the race card, I don't see color, I have Black friends, they're often used to shut down conversations about race and to deflect any accusations of racism.
It's a way to silence dissent while maintaining the status quo.
Exactly. And one of the most effective ways to dismantle these subtle forms of racism is to understand the ways in which they operate, to see them for what they are, attempts to maintain power and privilege.
And maybe the most frustrating example of this, the one that always makes my blood pressure spike, is the whole all lives matter counter-argument to Black Lives Matter.
It's a classic derailment tactic. And it's so frustrating because on the surface, it seems so benign, right? Of course, all lives matter. Who could possibly argue with that?
It's like saying all houses matter when your neighbor's house is on fire.
Exactly. It completely misses the point. The urgency lies in addressing the immediate threat, the house that's currently engulfed in flames.
And in this case, that burning house represents the Black community, which is disproportionately impacted by police brutality, by mass incarceration, by economic inequality, by a whole host of issues that stem from centuries of deliberate and often brutal oppression.
It's not about saying that other lives don't matter. It's about highlighting a very specific and very urgent crisis. And until we're willing to have those honest, uncomfortable conversations, until we're willing to center the experiences of those who are most marginalized, we're not going to make any real progress towards creating a more just and equitable society. Which brings us ultimately to the central argument of Boykin's book, the uncomfortable truth that he's not afraid to put front and center. Yes, everything is about race.
It's a bold statement, but after everything we've unpacked today, it's hard to argue with.
Right. And he doesn't just throw that out there as a provocation. He supports it with mountains of evidence, with historical analysis, with a deep understanding of how power operates in America. He argues that in a nation founded on the institution of slavery, a nation that built its wealth and its global dominance on the backs of enslaved Africans, race is not some incidental detail. It is the very foundation upon which this country was built.
And that foundation continues to shape everything: our institutions, our policies, our culture, are very understanding of what it means to be American.
And to pretend otherwise, to buy into this myth of a colorblind society, is to do a disservice to ourselves and to the generations that will come after us.
So where do we go from here? What do we do with this information?
Well, Boykin doesn't offer us easy answers, and I think that's because there aren't any. This work, the work of dismantling these systems of oppression, it's ongoing. It requires constant vigilance, constant self-reflection, a willingness to challenge our own biases, and a commitment to speaking out against injustice wherever we see it.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in dismantling these systems, whether we realize it or not.
Exactly. And that might look different for each of us. It might mean supporting organizations that are fighting for racial justice, educating ourselves about the history of race in this country, using our voices to amplify the stories of those who have been silenced, or simply having those uncomfortable conversations with our families and friends.
And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us commit to doing that work, to having those conversations, to challenging our own biases and the biases we see around us, we can start to bend that arc of the moral universe towards justice.
That's the hope, isn't it? To create a world where everyone, regardless of the color of their skin, has the opportunity to thrive. And I think Boykin's book is a great place to start.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's always a pleasure picking your brain.
Always happy to be here. Until next time.